Hello and welcome to another episode of Fabian Thinking Live, which brings you insightful and timely conversations on politics and policy. Now, next year will mark 90 years since the first poll was ever conducted in Britain. And today we're going to take you behind the scenes of polling, look at how pollsters generate their data, but also what the polls are saying about Labour. And if you want to ask the questions, email us at info@fabians.org.uk. Now, I'm delighted to be joined by Patrick English, who is YouGov's Head of Elections and Political and Social Data. Patrick, welcome to Fabian Thinking Live.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
So let's start right at the beginning. As I said, it was 90 years ago since the first polls were run in Britain. Why are they so important? Why have they become such a big feature of politics?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think everybody pays a lot of attention to polls, probably now more so than ever, not least because of the frequency with which we have polling these days. There are over 30 organisations in Britain registered with the British Polling Council alone who regularly produce polls, insights, and I think they're important because they give us a real sense of what people actually think about the world around them, be that political parties, be that their own intentions regarding voting, be that social policy, even things like, what crisp packet design do they prefer and all these sorts of things. The world of polling is much bigger than actually what you see reported on the news or on Twitter. It goes into all kinds of topics and all kinds of areas, and it's really an iceberg effect there, I guess. So I think what polling does, which we wouldn't otherwise have, is it gives us this idea, this touch point, this little moment in time about what people are really thinking, how they're feeling, how they're reacting to what they're seeing and experiencing in the world around them. And that creates a bit of an accountability mechanism for politicians as well. They can propose policies, they can talk about things, they can have a discussion, they can implement new things, and they can use polling data to see how the public are reacting to that and what their opinions are. Do they want more? Do they want less? Are they doing a good job? Are they doing a bad job? And adjust accordingly if they so wish.
And it is worth saying that one of the first polls said that was 64% of people said Neville Chamberlain was doing a good job, which is an interesting insights that we reflect over the 90 years. So let's start at the beginning of the process. Who are the people that you survey? How do pollsters recruit them? So I know when we do focus groups, we send a recruiter out into a shopping centre in some town in England. I'm sure you're not doing that. So how do you recruit them?
No, we don't do that. Well, it depends really from pollster to pollster and organisation to organisation, and indeed country to country, how exactly a pollster goes about their work. But speaking on behalf of YouGov, we have a panel of registered people. There's around about, last time I checked, sort of about 400,000 active people who are on that panel from all across Britain. Every corner, every postcode really is covered. And these people, they've chosen to join the panel. So that kind of makes them a slightly atypical type of person, in the same way that someone who's in a shopping centre when your focus group recruiter is a slightly atypical kind of person. But, we do our best to try and model and mitigate that kind of thing out. But we have these 400,000 people. They're registered to take our surveys. Every day, by and large, they will get an invite to come and take a YouGov survey. They don't know what it's about. It could be anything, as I say, crisp packets, car insurance, politics, social policy. It could be about anything. We do polling on all sorts of things. And what we're doing really is we're inviting as many people as we can into our systems, into our network, if you like. And then once they're in the network, they get assigned a particular poll, depending on who is needed in the poll. We do something called active quota sampling. So every survey we have, we want to make sure we have, a good balance of men and women, older people, younger people, higher educated, lower educated, people who voted for particular parties in the past, people who come from particular social and economic backgrounds, to try and build that representative sample. And what our system will do is it will say, these surveys could use a little bit more, let's say, Labour voters. These ones could use some more women. So they might get directed in particular surveys. And at the end of the day, what you then get, let's say 1,000, 2,000, perhaps more, I think we might come on to that later, people who've responded to a survey. And then we collect all the opinions from those people. We weight that to be representative of the country and all the key metrics. And then we produce the statistics. And that could be for a client, for their sort of internal purposes, could be for public consumption, or it could be for somebody who wants to go and make a splash in a newspaper. So there's all kinds of ways and means that we have, and that's how we recruit the people. That's how we get them from the panel into the survey and into the results that yourself and the viewers are probably seeing out there every day.
and that the Fabians, of course, published
Absolutely.
many a time, because if you have read one of our reports, Patrick, you're mentioned in a significant number of them. So frequently on social media, you will see something like, this poll can't possibly be accurate as I've never done a poll. I have done a poll, but imagine that I haven't. Or you'll see someone say, they've only asked 1,000 people. How can this possibly be representative of a country of millions? Do you want to just explain about how you get such a you've sort of hinted at it, but how do you get such representative results with such a small number of people?
I mean, the answer is incredibly sort of mathematical and statisticsy, but there's a really good analogy, actually. So if you imagine that I came in today and put on in front of you on the table a big cake, it's a nice big cake. It's got a few tiers. I've written "Hello Ben" on the top of it. Thanks for having me. This kind of thing. And I invite you to take a slice of the cake and tell me what kind of cake it is. You don't need to eat that entire cake to have a pretty good estimation of what kind of cake I brought you. You could take a little slice, chomp your way through it, get from top to bottom, and then let me know. Oh, it's a chocolate cake with some, perhaps some cream in it and other bits, and there's some sprinkles on the top. You didn't need to have the whole cake to tell me that. And that's a good analogy of how surveys work. Give or take a few percentage points here or there, and making sure that, the slice of cake you get is actually a good one, and you're not just kind of cut a weird bit out that only contained half of the filling or whatever. If you get a good little slice of the population and you talk to them, as long as that slice is representative, as long as the 1,000 people you have contain 52% women, 48% men, enough pensioners, enough younger people, and so on and so forth, you can basically then treat that as a pretty good estimation of how those opinions, how those things you're measuring fall out in the population. And that it kind of comes with what pollsters call a margin of error caveat. There's another whole nerdy statistical thing about margin of error, which I'm not going to go into.
I'm sure our members would like you to.
Bayesian statistics is a wonderful thing. But let's just call it uncertainty. And every pollster worth their salt will give you a statistic. They'll say, 40% of people think this, but given the sample size, given the topics involved, et cetera, there's a margin of error, or there's an uncertainty interval around that of plus or minus 3-4 percentage points. And what we're communicating there is we haven't spoken to everybody. Of course we couldn't. A, we kind of don't really need to, and B, that would be impossible. But given who we have spoken to, and given our assumptions about mathematics, statistics, surveys, et cetera, we can be pretty confident that if we say 40%, the true value is probably between 37 and 43. And sometimes that's wrong. That's probability and that's statistics. And sometimes you see errors in polling. But by and large, polling is actually really accurate and does a really good job at capturing things like opinions. And the benchmark proof for that, I guess, is election polling.
Mm-hmm. I guess you've obviously mentioned, I think 52% women, 48% men. What sort of data do you use to inform those? I think you call them weights in polling. What sort of data do you use? Yeah,
that's a great question. So as often as we can, in as many countries and contexts as we can, we look to use official government statistics on these things. We're quite blessed in the UK. You can go to various government websites and download increasingly detailed tables of how many women with degrees between the ages of 18 to 24 are there who live in the Northeast. You can actually get official data on that. So if we know that that's the official number, we're going to really try and push our sampling to make sure that we get that many people. And if we can't, we use the survey weights, the mathematics, to try and sort of balance that out in the survey afterwards. So we'll use government statistics, we'll use official election results to make sure we've got enough people who support each party in there. Then we'll start to go for other things like, let's say, political interest. We'll go to things like random probability surveys. So, that is really, people haven't selected to be in those at all. There's someone comes and knocks on the door, or they get something in the post and they reply to that. So you're taking another element out of the self-selection equation there. So we'll look at those for targets, sort of things like political interest and perhaps some other things. So it's kind of a combination of things, but as often as we can, we'll go to sources of official government statistics and try and make sure our samples reflect that as much as we possibly can.
So the first polls used postal surveys, then it was face-to-face, I guess, a bit like being in a shopping centre and trying to get people to ask your question. Then telephone surveys, but I read that they only supplanted face-to-face for the major newspapers in 1997, which seems slightly late in the technological innovation journey. And now, of course, it's predominantly online. How have you seen technology change the way that we understand people through polling and public attitudes research?
Yeah, great question. My sort of journey as a pollster started only in 2021, and by then, online panels were pretty much already dominant. But there are other countries where polling online is still quite rare and often looked down upon. Germany being a great example. We went out there in 2025 and 2021, in fact, but mainly in 2025, and trying to make a big claim and do a lot of election polling and a lot of commentary. And we got a lot of pushback from some people in the German media, from other pollsters, who criticised online panels and online polling as being kind of like a bit like unclean, a bit dirty, and a bit sort of below the bar. Despite in other countries such as the UK, online polling is the standard, and it's been proven to be capable of capturing opinions and voting intention again and again and again and again. So I think online polling still is on its journey, particularly international, and that's an exciting technological innovation. And we're getting better at that. We're getting better survey systems so we can show respondents more things. We can ask them more interesting questions. We can get them to watch videos. We can get them to interact with content in ways that you couldn't possibly do before. And that's another great advantage of online over telephone polling and over face-to-face polling. You know, I can basically sit there and show you a video. Well, I don't show you, the computer does. And then you can kind of click on bits you like, click on bits you don't like. Imagine doing that in a face-to-face setting. I need to bring a computer with me and shove it in front of you and then take all kinds of different metrics. But you can do that online very quickly, very efficiently. And what that does as well is it means that polling becomes affordable. It democratizes it, really. And, when we're talking about 97 with phone polling replacing face-to-face, a standard poll would cost, tens of thousands of pounds. If you wanted to do polling, you would have to pay an extortionate amount of money. So information on what the public thought really just became the reserve of people who could afford to ask that question. Whereas now, not to make a plug, but if you come to YouGov with a couple of £100, you can find out what people think about something. So I think that's a really major innovation and really good thing that's happened with online polling and technology as technology has come into polling. And I think a little bit later we might talk about AI and that in itself bringing in a whole new revolution in polling and particularly text data. But yeah, there's been quite a lot of stuff. Me personally, I've largely just kind of seen the online polling get better and AI's new technology come into that. And we're still very much learning how best to apply that.
Well, let's go into AI. I remember, a couple of years ago, we asked you to poll people's reaction to, I think the phrase green energy or net zero. And you gave us, I think, about 2,000 responses, which I had to go through by hand and sort of check which sort of bucket or theme they went into. One person said it reminded them of Kermit, which I thought was nice, not particularly relevant. But,
not particularly useful, but yeah.
But now in more recent stuff that we've done with you, you've used AI to be able to categorise free text or open text responses. So I guess what has AI enabled you and people who are working with you to do? But I guess also what are the dangers of using AI as well in polling?
Yeah, I'm all over this question at the minute. One of the things I'm really working on at YouGov at the moment is the use of AI for political text data and for political polling conversations. Because, we'll start more broadly. AI has been a real game changer for the polling industry regarding text data and collection, analysis, presentation, and reporting of it. As you kind of suggested before, even sort of 3-4 years ago, when we were collecting open responses from people, either we as a company or the people we're doing the polling for would then have to take that open-ended data, look through it, code it up, come up with categories, comb back through it, reallocate categories, then sort of merge them if they were too small, think about meta categories and scopes. We don't have to do that anymore because we have AI models that are capable of kind of in minutes, really, scrolling through all of this data, picking out the themes, understanding the language, understanding the sentiments, and making that into like a report, like a corpus, or even coding the individual responses for you and giving that back as numeric data. That's another great thing it can do. It's not just about summarizing anymore. It can quantify, which is a really powerful innovation. Other things it can do, obviously, as with every company, it's helping us with efficiency. So it's helping us get faster, which means we can cut down overheads, which means we can keep prices down, which is always great.
We appreciate it.
Absolutely. Yeah, indeed. And it means that we can sort of look to other innovative products such as chatbots. So we can load chatbots into surveys to help us collect slightly more detailed open text data. Now, it's not quite the same as a focus group. It's never going to be. But you can start getting, rather than, let's say, one open-ended question worth of responses, you can quite quickly get a chatbot to give you 5 questions, and they kind of follow up a little bit and they ask to explore key themes. So that's really cool. That's a great innovation. In terms of the risks and the drawbacks, there are quite a few. AI is obviously an amazing technology, but it is in many ways still emergent. And we are still kind of getting to grips with what its capabilities are and what its capabilities aren't. And at the same time, people who design AIs are constantly pushing those capabilities and pushing those boundaries, and then kind of playing catch up as to what they've actually done and how it can actually be exported. And we are kind of at some end of the wedge of that in polling data when we're trying to import these technologies to polling. One of the things that we worked on in 2024, and we still have today, is the disconnect between an AI's ability to understand everyday language and its ability to understand political language. And those are two very different things. When you think about the way that you might discuss confidence in an everyday conversation or confidence in a political conversation, you're potentially talking about two completely different things. And the context of that politics wasn't always, and still really isn't always, well captured by generalist AI models. So we went down the route of thinking, okay, let's import some more human training into this, exercise more control, exercise a couple of stages of checks on our AI coders, and make sure, when the AI says, oh yeah, people, think that this person should be more conservative, well, are they talking big C or small c conservative? Because that, again, is a very important contextual difference, which probably we definitely still need to have control over at the minute, probably still do into the future. And the last thing I would say, perhaps a limitation or a drawback or a potential danger with AI, not to put too much of a negative spin on it, but synthetic data, I think, is an interesting pressure point for the polling industry. So synthetic data, very briefly, is the idea that, let's say you wanted a poll of 2,000 people. I gave you 1,000 respondents, and then I trained an AI to basically replace the other 1,000 with digital twins or personas or people that looked exactly like the 1,000, and then train that to kind of give you a response deck of 2,000 people. Some polling companies are providing this. We're not. But it presents an interesting challenge and an interesting sort of conceptual, I would say, difference or conceptual question as to what is polling? What is it for? What is technology? What is it for? If we're going to use weighting, can we use synthetic respondents? At the minute, kind of our position is no, but who knows, things might change in the future. And there certainly are companies that think, well, you can and you should leverage AI in this way, and you should present this data, and you should sort of say, well, this is representative of the population. Now, I think there are a lot of open questions about that. And I think if that is going to become something of a norm, the industry and perhaps regulators should be pretty tough on explaining and communicating the difference between that sort of data and when it is and when it isn't used. But, there's all kinds of emergent technologies happening right now. And that's probably just one of them, which is an interesting pressure point on the industry right now.
And I think with sort of using AI to replicate answers, I think you only have to be in one focus group to realise how weird political opinions can be, that they don't necessarily fit together in a logical way. So I've seen stuff online where people are like, well, the government can't, in fact, the government might have been rumoured to be testing policy in AI-generated focus groups or with AI-generated polling. Do you think that's a good thing for the government to be doing, or do you think actually it's potentially risky, not necessarily from a data quality perspective, but actually from a wanting to understand public opinion? Should you be relying on AI for that?
I mean, given my position and the position of YouGov, I'm definitely going to say I'd throw a lot of caution on that for sure. I think, particularly in the world of politics, the consequences for political decisions and political discourse are very strong on individual people's lives every single day, right? So I think it's paramount and it's so important that you fully trust and you fully understand the data that you have, that you can couch it where it needs to be couched. You can put it in its right context, and you can make your decisions as a politician, as political leaders and think leaders based on a sort of full understanding of the data that you have in front of you. I think with AI and with AI-generated data and AI-generated responses, as brilliant and as powerful as they can be, and I've seen some of these models in action and they're really impressive, but they're still generalists. And they're still giving you sort of, if not expected responses, then an expected response based on the input data. But, there are a lot of potential dangers there, a lot of potential things, a lot of potential black box activities that might lead to certain unexpected outcomes. I remember looking through some AI-generated data once, and the aggregate headline figures kind of looked pretty sensible, and the model looked like it captured sort of nationally the mood on a certain topic quite well. As soon as you look down the cross breaks, things looked really strange. And if that was, I was sitting here and thinking about it, if that was sort of been in a policy document put in front of a minister who sort of wasn't aware that that data was done in that way, or sort of was relying on that, that'd be a pretty dangerous position to get in, I think, because it wouldn't actually be a good representation of the opinions you're trying to measure. So, I would throw a lot of caution onto that and say, if you want to get general reads on things, if you want to get understandings, if you want to analyze text data, if you want to get a good sense of themes and ideas, it's in a really strong place to do that. But right now, in terms of generating response data, it's the jury's still out. Let's put it that way.
So AI is not useful to understand the seawall, for example.
I don't know.
That's the message I'm taking away from this. Now, you, as I've said, have worked a lot with the Fabians on many different polling projects. You've corrected many of my questions to make sure they're technically accurate or not inadvertently leading, which means, as you say, a more accurate picture of the public mood. I guess, what are the biggest red flags that you've seen in terms of polling, or perhaps uses of polling that make you wince slightly when you read them?
Oh, I wince every day. No. There's, the head of my department, YouGov's a guy called Anthony Wells, and he has,
I know him well.
He's probably corrected far more questions than anybody else will ever do in their lives, to be honest. He's made a profession out of that and many other things. I kind of come from the school of thought where he kind of sets down, where you're always looking for ways in which, as you say, advertently or even inadvertently, questions might lead respondents or might trigger certain thought processes you're not thinking about, or might get them to consider things in a ways that you haven't intended in the questionnaire design. So to kind of put more of a different spin on that, the main sort of common ways that you can see polling being misused from a questionnaire design perspective is, let's say you want to measure support or opposition to a policy. Let's say, I don't know, it's two-child benefit, for example, put it that way. And we can say, if you were going to mislead the respondents, you might put a paragraph in front of that which says, the child poverty is really, really, really bad. It's one of the worst sort of factors that you could put on a child. It's one of the best predictors of a child failing later in life, so on and so forth. The best thing that we could do is alleviate child poverty. Do you agree that we should therefore lift the child benefit cap? So that would be an example of leading the respondent to a certain answer, because you're giving them information that A, isn't probably really necessary to answer the question anyway. B, you're getting them to really think about a certain thing. And C, you're kind of pushing them almost like in a social desirability way. You're almost threatening them to say no, right? You're saying, go on, I dare you. After having read all that stuff about poor children, I dare you to say that you oppose lifting that cap. So that's one way that can happen. Another way is that you can even bias responses in the question in the responses themselves. So you could have, a very simple question: do you support or oppose leaving the ECHR? And you could have in the response options, yes, we should leave, and then 5 different ways of saying no. And that would also be a bad measurement, because you should really have even scales so that people who have slightly strong positive opinions or negative opinions can place themselves on the scale, and it will make sense and people feel well represented. The other thing that you see happen quite often is you'll kind of use inappropriate scales for different types of questions. So you might, for example, say, do you support or oppose this particular thing, when that particular thing is more of a feeling than a policy? So it's making sure that all the sort of the component parts of the questions all match up, that you're presenting things in a neutral, unbiased way, that the respondent can reasonably answer the question. You know, how many migrants do you think have come to the country today? That's not really a reasonable question for somebody to be able to answer. And even if they did give you an answer, I wouldn't be entirely sure what you would be measuring there. So there's lots of different ways that polling can go wrong. And some of them are subtle and some of them are advertent, some of them are inadvertent. And you've got to be on the lookout for it at all times. And, you know, Anthony's corrected many of my own questions. Yeah. So it happens to all of us, but you've got to be as fair and as unbalanced, as balanced and unbiased as we possibly can in our designs as well as our reporting and our interpretation.
I think one of the biggest challenges is always a temptation to say X support a specific policy and therefore the government should do it, because invariably it's in the 70%. And I always say, you know, unless you mention who the political party is that are introducing it, it's basically a meaningless question. Because,
absolutely.
You know, people will support, you know, scrapping the two-child, but actually they won't support scrapping the two-child limit, as we know from the politics.
Sure.
But, you know, nationalising water might be incredibly popular. The moment that you mention that the Labour Party wants to nationalise water, you've got a significant problem there. And you can see that with the 2019 manifesto.
Well, quite.
Being a case in that.
And there's, so just to go on that point as well, like there's things in isolation, polling things in isolation is tricky to do as well. Because as you say, let's say you have one question, standalone, do you support or oppose nationalising water? You'll get loads of people saying yes. If you put that on which of these things would you like the government to focus on next, nationalising water is going to come pretty far down. Things like immigration, cost of living, et cetera, are going to be right up there at the top. So, yeah, there's an important thing to do where, you know, fine, if you really want to measure support or opposition in isolation, okay. But you have to be mindful of the fact that all of that is operating in a much wider opinion context, a much wider political context. And really when it's up against things that are going to command sort of majority attention, your thing that might have 70% support kind of fades away.
Yeah. Instructive for all of us when we care about our passion project. One final question before we sort of go on to, I guess, the political situation and the use of the results. You've worked in Canada, you've worked in Denmark, you've worked in Australia, you've worked in Germany. In fact, every time I message you, it seems to be you're in another country doing
I'm not avoiding you, I promise.
Well, it seems like you are, but you're here at least, so that proves that you're not. You obviously mentioned Germany. They prefer phone polls over online. What are the sort of biggest differences in terms of polling in those countries versus, you know, polling in the UK?
Yeah, obviously in some of those countries the language is a difference.
Denmark's slightly tricky.
Yeah. My Danish is not so good. I don't even know how to say not so good in Danish. So language is definitely one. And when we're working in countries where we don't have a first language speaker within the political team here in the UK, we try and make sure we have people on the ground who do and can help us out in that regard. I think the differences are often the obvious ones, but they matter in perhaps non-obvious ways. So Denmark is a great example because it's a proportional representation system. You know, you have all these different parties. You have to make sure that you're paying attention to what you're saying about the biggest party and the smallest party at the same time, because they have something called a threshold. So if you're a Danish political party seeking to get representation in the Volksdag, you need to get over 2% of the national vote. If you don't, you drop out. And that has two effects. One, it means the rest of the seats in the parliament get sort of reallocated to the parties who are in there. And the second thing is it will massively affect the coalition building that can go on after the election. So in the Danish context, what we had to pay a lot of attention to was not just making sure we had the national vote intention figures right, but also that we were being very careful to pay attention to who we were saying was in and out of the parliament, because the story we'd be telling about the election and who might be able to form a government afterwards could be completely different depending on which parties are in and which parties are out. And so that introduces a whole other way of thinking about it. elections and thinking about election polling that you might not necessarily think about in the UK. The Australian example, of course, they have compulsory voting. So it's another thing that not a lot of countries have, but they have compulsory voting, and they also have ranked order voting. So while you didn't necessarily have to model turnout, you had to make sure that you had a really good representation of all the voters in the samples, and you had to make sure that you had a really good representation of preferences all the way down the ballot. And sometimes those ballots were 12 parties long or 12 candidates long. And it was quite a coding challenge. I think the script that we had to produce all of the preference flows when you started getting to deciding who was going to win the seats, I can't remember, I think it's like 3,500 lines long, looking for all the different permutations of different parties in different positions and different candidates and different voter flows. So that was, obviously we don't have to do anything like that in the UK. And that was a big challenge there. Germany, to use a final example, they have 2 votes. So kind of like you do in Scotland and you used to have in Wales. 2 votes, so you have one where you elect a constituency MP and one where you elect a regional MP. And then, so you had to get basically almost 2 elections right, because again, you'd have different candidates, different parties predicted to do well in the different areas. And you had to try and make sure that you had a good model for both, because if you had a good model for one and not the other, you'd call the election wrong. So you kind of having your eyes across those 2 models and making sure that they were both as good as they could possibly be was really important in Germany as well.
One really niche specific question, but I'm because I am a fan of Denmark. I assume you used online surveys for the Faroe Islands and for Greenland. I assume you weren't ringing people up in Greenland and going, because obviously that's a very different political system in terms of the parties are not the same on mainland Denmark.
Yeah, I'll make a confession.
They will hate the fact that I've said that because it's technically they are semi-independent. But
yeah, you could expect some very
angry.
No one
from the Faroe Islands is watching.
Well, they might turn up tomorrow. You never know.
Maybe.
Make a confession. We didn't actually poll or model either of those 2 areas. We fit a likelihood model based on what's happened in those areas previously, because as you say, they're so unique and they're so difficult to do and so difficult to capture opinion in. So we actually didn't directly poll there. I'm not sure if we even could if we tried. It'd be really, really difficult. I think much like a constituency poll in Britain, the only real way to do it would probably be to go with clipboards and and letters and really sort of gauge opinion that way. Because there's such specific communities. Online sort of panel penetration just kind of doesn't really exist there, and it'd be a real challenge for us to produce anything meaningful.
Faroe Islands are lovely in August, so if you want to do
the
equivalent of a constituency poll in the Faroe Islands, I would recommend that time. So let's move on to the use of polling and the political situation at the moment. And I should say, if you haven't submitted your question, please email info@fabians.org.uk and we'll ask them to Patrick. So you mentioned right at the start that 30 or so polling companies who've arguably never had more information about what the public think. Yet it does seem to be that we actually also simultaneously have a less of an understanding of what the public think. So, on issues like climate change and on migration, I think we can be reasonably confident what the vast majority of people think. Yet you hear politicians who claim to be populist calling net stupid zero, which I think is an offence of grammar, if nothing else. Do we actually have too much, potentially, information, and that is making it very difficult for politicians to understand exactly what the public want?
It's a good question. I think some of it goes back to our earlier chat about sort of questionnaire design and about polling and its uses. For a lot of these things, there's a fairly clear consensus if you ask the questions in a straight back way. But there are permutations of questions on net zero, on migration, on the ECHR, for example, where if you kind of frame it in certain ways or you present certain trade-offs, which can be a legitimate way to measure opinion, by the way, you can get different responses. So as far as a politician is looking, there's probably a poll somewhere that says, quote unquote, what they want to be able to say out in the media or to their voters, to their base, to the kind of people that they're trying to gather support from. So yeah, the vast volume of information, the vast volume of polling does create an information space where if you wanted to find a poll that said people want to give up on net zero, you probably could. There's probably one that says, net zero is responsible for all your bills going up, by the way. Do you think we should get rid of net zero? That kind of poll probably would show that kind of level of support. So, or in a more legitimate sense, you might get a poll that says, would you rather the government spend focus on reducing your energy bills or increasing renewables? Now, someone might reasonably argue that that's not mutually exclusive, but in that kind of trade-off scenario, you'd probably get much more people say, no, spend money now on getting my bills down, as in give me checks through the door, that kind of thing. So, yes, the more information there is, the more pollsters there are, the more questions are asked in more ways, and you can find more ways to interpret what's going on. And to kind of get more deep and philosophical about the question, it's all of these measurements that we take of public opinion are point in time, and they are specific measurements of specific ways of asking specific questions. The human brain at a fundamental level is far more complicated than that, far more complex than that. Politics is far more complex than that. As you kind of alluded to, very few people think in ideological ways. Voters, the public, are very a la carte in their opinions about things. Some people are very sort of pro action on climate change and anti-immigration, and they don't see a tension for that in that whatsoever. If you kind of try to take that in a policy booklet through the doors of the House of Commons, you probably wouldn't get very far. And so, in terms of are we understanding, or do we have a correct conception of public opinion and what voters think? I think that's almost impossible to do because they're so complicated and there's so many different layers to it and there's so many different dynamics, and opinions change and they can change quite rapidly. And you gave a great example. You can just slap a party label on it and suddenly support or opposition changes by 20%. So there's a lot going on there, and I think we can we can be confident that so long as we've done our questionnaire design right and we've got a good sample, the question we've asked and we've got the response is what people how they would respond to that question. But there are potentially 20, 25 other ways we could have asked it or framed it, and you might get a different response.
I think there's some really interesting evidence in America that shows actually public support for a political party or policy position depends more on how you talk about it than what the actual thing is. So I guess that speaks to you can almost generate a result. It depends how you phrase it or what you talk about. So there's lots of conversation about Britain being a 5-party political system. Now, at least in England, I think, in Scotland it's been more than 2 parties for quite some time, and same in Wales. And there's also the creation of bloc politics, which in theory would move us very similar to Denmark or potentially to Australia as well. That's required through the sort of preference system. What does that look like, when it comes to polling? Are we seeing that? What has happened over the past 12 months in terms of voter attitude, voting intention?
Yeah, I think the story goes back probably 18 months, maybe a little bit longer. So in fact, let's start from the top. 2024 general election. Labour win a huge majority on a record low share of the vote. 35% in Great Britain, landed in majority, 66% of the seats. Almost double. So it was a majority that was kind of wafer thin, and it was built on, even that 35%, a lot of that support was tactical. It was borrowed from voters who wanted to oust the Conservatives and wanted to get rid of the Conservatives from power, having been there for 14 years. The story that we saw in the immediate aftermath of that election, sort of 6 months that followed that, was quite quickly just a pretty fast unravelling of that tactical support. Labour's, a lot of people who voted for Lib Democrats or Greens, where that made more sense, went back into the Labour column. But there were far more people who were voting for Labour. There were tactical loanees, if you like, from the Lib Dems and from the Greens. And they went back into that vote intention column quite quickly. The reason being for that is, we could get into the politics of it, perhaps not, but a lot of the stuff around winter fuel, a lot of disappointment that the promised change never really arrived, certainly at any great pace. So people, I think, got quite frustrated quite quickly and went back into their camps. And then over the next sort of 12 months leading us up to now, the frustration with the government has only grown. And the sense that the Labour government have not done what they were elected to do or what they were sort of put in position to do, so far as they were put in position to do anything, as in sort of make change in people's lives, make politics sort of a bit less sort of like all sort of encompassing and all in your face and in the news all day, every day, scandals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That just hasn't happened. And this is what voters tell us in their sort of day-to-day conversations that we have with them. They haven't seen the kind of change that they wanted to see from that 2024 election, the kind of change that they felt that they were promised. So what we're then seeing is really a fragmentation of Labour's 2024 coalition into many different places. But as you've kind of hinted at there in the question, the vast majority of it went in the same direction as it did in the first 6 months of the Labour administration. Rather than these big sort of swings that we might have seen in days gone by between Labour and the Conservatives, like across the aisles, if you like, what's starting to happen now is voters stick in their quote-unquote blocks on the left or on the right. So Labour has been far more likely to lose voters to the Greens, Liberal Democrats, to Plaid Cymru in Wales and to the SNP than it has to Reform or the Conservatives. There are voters that are making that journey, but they are far fewer in number than the ones who are staying, let's say, on that side of the same side of the political divide as Labour and just kind of moving between parties there. Then on the other side of the equation, the Conservatives, of course, in 2024 suffered their worst ever election result, 24% of the vote. They've gone down since then. If you listen to some of the commentary around the Conservatives right now, you kind of might forget that. But I guess, compared to maybe a year ago, they have improved their position, but they're still down on where they were in their worst ever election result. And that is largely to do with the performance of Reform UK, who have gone from a party that won 5 MPs and 15% of the vote in GB in 2024 to now anywhere between sort of pick your pollster 25 to 30%. And they are the ones who are leading the polls. They've led the polls consistently now for sort of 18 months. They are really the ones to beat if you're going to win the next general election. And they have been getting most of their support from the Conservatives, a bit from Labour, a bit from new voters as well, who sat out at the last election, but predominantly from Conservative voters. So again, it's that sort of that block theory, that idea that rather than reaching across aisles, British politics is now becoming more and more about which parties or which sort of groups of parties are most dominant within their political space. As you say, that kind of leads us more to a Denmark sort of style system, perhaps, where you have these blocks that kind of sit there, and depending on your flavour of ice cream, you're going to go and vote for a particular party within a particular block, probably well within the knowledge that at the end of the day, when it all comes out in the wash, they're going to be the ones going into coalition negotiations together. And I think, to put a little bit of a crystal ball on it, do we end up like Denmark? Do we end up more like in Australia? Do we end up sort of more like a hugely fragmented sort of majoritarian-ish system like we have in France? Probably depends on what, if anything, is done with the voting system in this country in the years to come.
But it is the case that the right-wing bloc has got larger since the election. We saw that particularly at the local election. Yeah. So is that more due to differential turnout, i.e. Reformer turning out either their voters in 2024 or new voters who didn't vote in 2024, or is it more due to that switch between Labour 24 and Reform, and therefore, Labour still has to appeal to those voters to get them back into the left-wing bloc?
Yeah, so there's two really important questions in there. One, why is it, or how is it that the right bloc is larger, or support for parties that we would say are on the right of the British political spectrum is greater than on the left? It is a bit of column A and a bit of column B. Reform certainly are turning out voters who sat out in 2024. They probably did vote in previous elections. I don't personally buy the idea that there are suddenly these new vast swathes of voters that have never voted in their life suddenly coming out to vote for Reform. I don't think that's a very realistic story.
It's also very hard to know because famously people's memory about who they previously voted for is a bit sketchy.
It is, and exactly, and they will overstate their own turnout as well and say, I definitely voted in that election when perhaps they didn't. Like measuring turnout and measuring sort of past support in surveys, very difficult, as you say. So it's a difficult case to prove at the best of times. But it certainly is the case that people have moved from that left bloc to the right bloc. And that is quite geographically concentrated as well, which leads into the second question. Labour to reform switches are definitely real. I've been quoted a lot recently saying, Labour to Green, that's the biggest bloc, that's the biggest mover, that's where most of the voters are going. That is true. However, there are still Labour to Reform voters. And the problem for many Labour MPs, particularly in the Midlands and the North, is that those voters count twice, because it's Reform who are coming up behind them, or already behind them in second place, trying to take the seat off them. So they hurt more. So even though Labour may be losing, and I think the evidence, particularly from the locals, is quite overwhelming, they are losing more voters to their left. The ones to the right count double and so hurt more, and particularly in those seats in the Midlands and the North where Labour are defending against Reform. So it's definitely the case that is happening, and it's electorally potentially very consequential for Labour. So they have to find a strategy that allows them to speak to those voters. But if they're doing so at the expense of the voters leaving them on the left flank, they're going to be stuck under 20%, and they are not winning an election from 20% or under of the vote.
So does Labour have a base anymore? I guess
They
after the
do.
local elections, that is a very fair question.
They do. They certainly do have a base. There is a group that has remained quite loyal to Labour, and they tend to be from a higher socioeconomic status. They tend to be degree educated. They tend to be sort of not overwhelmed, like super young, but sort of you'd still classify them as, let's say, young working age. They tend to be financially quite secure, and they tend to be people who have probably benefited from some of the policies that the Labour government has implemented. We talk a lot about the misses and about the things that Labour have done wrong. They would quite fairly argue there's a lot of things that they have done and a lot of changes they have made. And there are a number of voters who have and who are and will be feeling the benefits of that, particularly on things like childcare and sort of working arrangements, who are probably looking at what the government has done and thinking, fair cop. And those do tend to be from those sort of backgrounds. Interestingly, economic security, is a slight tangent on this, is a really powerful predictor of whether a similar-ish looking person is going to defect from Labour to the Greens or basically stay loyal. So economic insecure voters have really been flooding away from Labour in different directions, and sort of interacting that with age and geography is a really sort of nice little graph you can do as whether they're going off to Reform, whether they're going to the Greens, et cetera, et cetera. But it's the ones who are more economically secure, which, if you think about the history of the Labour Party and you think about how Labour MPs, any of them that might be sort of listening to this or after it, might think about that, it's probably going to hurt a little bit to hear that it is the more financially better off who are sticking with the party now than the let's say the more working class voters.
And particularly tricky with economic shocks
Very
down
very
the track.
The cost of living crisis hasn't gone away and isn't going away anytime soon, really.
Yeah, and I would say that obviously how Labour can win back economically insecure voters is such a priority, certainly in my work, and I think of colleagues. Just generally sort of looking at polling, is the rise of this five-party politics making it harder for pollsters to try and get an accurate prediction? So, I think a few months ago, only a couple of pollsters had Greens in second place, but then a few pollsters had them in fourth place. The Labour vote share varied by 4 or 5 percentage points. Again, speaking to the fact that we've got so many polls, maybe they are sort of, as an average, converging, but does that make it really difficult? And is it a problem that we're seeing such divergence in results? Yeah.
It is really hard. The more parties you have, the more things which are going to structure different types of partisanship and different types of party support, the harder it is to build models that will correctly, as far as you can with statistics, like estimate how people are going to vote and what election results are going to be, and to effectively capture the opinion of people, even in non-sort of overtly political big P senses as well. Because, all right, you might have the correct number of Labour voters, but do you have the right number of Labour voters? Are the Labour voters you have sort of the tactical green ones? Are they the more sort of economically secure ones? Are they now deserters? Are they loyalists? There's all these different conversations now about even the coalitions that you're waiting back to from the previous election, which suddenly come into play. And the other thing that the five-party system and sort of 6 to plus in other parts of the country, it makes paying attention to and working with geography more important, because different types of parties are doing well in different types of areas. You saw the Greens making some really, for them, tremendous gains in the local elections, but they were mostly restricted to urban areas. Outside of those urban areas, they didn't really fare quite as well. But still, like on the national picture, they were coming either third or second in the projected national shares from that election. So it's really important to pay attention to geography and how that interacts with the sort of the new multi-part system that we're arriving at. And the challenges that brings is, as you say, making sure you've got all the different types of people that you need, all the different types of voters, all different types of potential constellations across all different types of potential geographies that are going to matter. And that's very interesting and important. And the example I might close on with that is what happened in Wales was a very sort of different tactical situation, very different tactical outcome to what happened, say, for example, perhaps in London or in some other areas. There are a lot of voters out there who are motivated to stop reform from winning for whatever reason that they have. And the voters in Wales, a lot of them decided the best way to do that was to vote for Plaid. Voters in other areas thought, better go for Labour, better go for Greens. Even some, better go for the Conservatives. So
I thought you were going to say Lib Dems.
yeah, probably as well. And the tactical element of it as well, and then sort of the I'm voting to keep this party out thing also rises in multi-party systems and complicates it even further.
So let's just quickly, before we go, because we're going to have to talk about Makerfield, I'm afraid, but let's just quickly go to two political parties. So first with the Greens, are they struggling with Zach Polanski's eco-populism in terms of, if you look at 2024, two of their seats were in rural, probably quite small C conservative, really care probably about river pollution and water pollution. And then you obviously have Brighton and Bristol, who are unique places, shall we say. Zach Polanski is definitely, I would say, a Brighton and a Bristol appeal.
Yeah.
Is there any risk for them in losing their small C conservative base, I guess, or those who, particularly because they've got quite a few councillors in those places?
Yeah.
Is there a risk for them there?
I think there is a risk, but what the Greens have been able to do even pre-Polanski is they have been quite successfully able to present themselves as a different kind of party depending on the electorate they were talking to. So you mentioned there you had a lot of Greens in a lot of rural areas winning, and they were campaigning on things like, well, we shouldn't build this sort of big industrial unit here, whereas a Green in sort of Brighton might say, well, we should build plenty of those, please, and build in general. So it's almost like what the Lib Dems were able to do to kind of build up their representation locally before then going into Westminster, is to present themselves as a different kind of party, campaigning on different issues in different ways, in different geographies. But you're right, for them it touches on this real important split that they have. It's like the Ramses and the Denyers versus the sort of Polanskis of the party. There is a real chasm there within that party. A lot of Greens are quite new to the party. A lot of their elected representatives even now are quite new to the party, and they've come in after Labour's sort of 2024 victory, some of them before, quite frustrated with the direction of the Labour Party, wanting a more populist left-wing appeal. Polanski kind of came in and gave them that in the leadership election. They went up in the polls dramatically after that, it has to be said. But another thing that is worth saying, and I think does speak to the kind of concerns that you might be talking about so far as the Greens go, Zach Polanski started when we started putting him in some national polling with a pretty neutral, maybe even slightly positive favourability rating. And the longer the Greens have been successful and stayed in the news, and he's been successful and stayed in the news, his favourability ratings have got more and more negative. So I think that, when a party is new and it's upcoming and it's perhaps doesn't have quite a lot of national scrutiny or much of an agenda in that sense, voters can project onto it what they like, and it makes it easier for those local parties to kind of pull off the whole, we're about this here and we're about this there. The higher and the more significant and the more talked about a national profile gets for a party, that begins to erode, and the voters do less projection or can do less projection. They see more of what it's actually about, and as it tends to go in British politics, they tend to decide they don't like it.
So Adrian's Ramsey strategy of being virtually unknown might not necessarily have been a bad thing. So quickly, the Conservatives, obviously, as you say, a lot of their vote share has gone to reform. Do you think any more can go? Is that the limit of the losses, or can it still completely fall apart for them?
Yeah, there are
more
some,
than it has.
Yeah, well, quite. They had some successes in the council elections in 26. They talk a lot about Westminster. They're talking up their chances of winning Arbroath, the by-election up there. No, sorry, no, Aberdeenshire South, sorry, not Arbroath, that's the one with Labour. But so, there certainly are signs of recovery, especially compared to where they were 12 months ago. There are always more voters to lose. And there are certainly a lot of Conservative people in the Conservative column right now who are quite open to telling us that they're very, very up for voting reform if and when they decide that might be a better idea. So the jury is very much still out on Kemi Badenoch and on this iteration of the Conservative Party and their ability to speak to the voters that have drifted away to reform or are considering it or are kind of just sitting things out at the minute. I don't think there is an overwhelming sense among Conservative voters, either past or present, that things are, fine and dandy and that the party is on its way back. So definitely things could get worse again. I think there's probably enough in the data we're seeing and enough in the election results to suggest that they're settling on something that might look like a core strategy for the next election, talking about economics, talking about Labour's record, talking about tax. And the Pat McFadden quote I think is going to be very useful to them in elections to come, perhaps. And we might see that, and we've already seen it on their socials. We could probably expect to see that on a few leaflets come the next election. So I think there's enough to suggest that they're figuring out a strategy that keeps them probably above water. But even then, that's still below their record defeat in 2024. Now, I'll caveat that with, if we are in a multi-party system, probably every party is going to be dropping back bar reform on 2024 and perhaps the Greens as well. But, there are still a lot of risks for the Conservatives out there for sure.
So 2 more questions before we wrap up. Who's going to win Makerfield?
I knew you'd ask me that. Well, the available polling on Makerfield suggests a very tight race between Labour and Reform. I have no reason to doubt that that's exactly what's going on. I think a couple of the key questions will be, what does turnout look like? Do we see something similar as what we saw in Gorton and Denton and in Caerphilly, whereby voters who absolutely do not want Reform to win in the seat turn out, stop Reform from winning and get the message per se as to who the most likely party to do that is? I don't think, Labour contested that quite heavily in nationally in Gorton and Denton, but I don't think there was really much in the data to suggest that was actually the case. But on the flip side, this time, I don't think there's any contest really as to who, if you don't want Reform to win, who probably is the best bet to stop that happening if you are so inclined in Makerfield. So that's an interesting dynamic, I think, to keep an eye on. Can Labour turn out those voters? Do they go and vote Labour? Do Labour coalesce that anti-Reform vote? On the flip side, can Reform turn out more voters? They start from such a strong position in Makerfield. This isn't like Gorton and Denton. They had a very good result there in 2024. They won all the wards there in the 2026 local elections. But a thorn in their side might be Restore and Rupert Lowe. And he's come in and he's throwing a lot at that. And he might be eating into what otherwise could be a Reform vote. And that, at the end of the day, that might be the difference between Reform winning and losing that seat.
So Restore and not a social media phenomenon necessarily?
Not necessarily. I think we're hearing enough and we're seeing enough from some of the published data to suggest that they are picking up votes, they are getting momentum, and that there is a voter base in Britain who are looking for a party on the right but don't want the Conservatives or Reform right now and are looking for something else and looking for another offer. And Restore right now look to be a potential avenue for them, but we'll have to wait and see on that one.
So one final question. To prepare for this, I checked France, Portugal, Spain, South Korea, Italy, Cyprus, Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Hungary, Luxembourg, and Slovenia,
oh, wow.
all according to Wikipedia, bar the publication of opinion polls some days before polling day. I'm going to guess what you career-wise have to say, but should the UK do the same?
I mean, ultimately, that's a question for politicians.
That's
I
such
think,
a political answer.
Exactly, it is. I'm going to be so biased in my response. That, of course, I think you shouldn't be banning opinion polls, because what that will do, it kind of alludes to my previous answer. You just democratize knowledge, because opinion polling won't stop. There are 2 ways it won't stop. One is if you ban the publication of polls, well, people will just do private polling. And then what will happen is you'll have MPs or sort of would-be MPs or politicians, leaders, claiming this, that, and the other about public opinion and saying, we're ahead now. We've suddenly shot up 200 seats since the opinion polls were banned. We're the ones with momentum. Vote for us, when that might not necessarily be the case. And the other way that it probably won't do anything anyway is that, and this is what you see in these countries, by the way, which do ban opinion polling, is that someone will just go and publish an opinion poll in a country next door. And there'll be nothing that could be legally done about that. And given the internet and given the access and speed to information right now, I think there's a great example of, I can't remember, I think it might have been from France or possibly Spain, where one of the pollsters was just publishing in a regional Australian newspaper their latest vote intention numbers all the way up until election day, because there was a ban in the lead up to it. So I personally think that bans just make opinion measurements and make knowledge the reserve of people who can afford it, rather than the public, who ultimately are the providers of those opinions, so they should have access to it. And it probably wouldn't work anyway, because people just find ways around it.
Well, that was fascinating. Thank you so much, Patrick, for all of that. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Fabian Thinking Live, and we'll see you again for another insightful conversation about politics and policy. Thank you for joining us.